Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. On January 11th, 5 days after the attack on the Capitol, the Democratic-led House of Representatives approved a single article of impeachment against now former President Donald Trump. President Trump, reads the article, engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States. The article cites his false claims of election fraud in the months leading up to the riot, which he repeated on January 6th, as well as a phone call he made to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which Trump urged him to, quote, find votes to overturn the results there. The article specifically refers to Trump's address to supporters on the day of the violence, arguing that he willfully made statements that, in context, encouraged and foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol, such as him saying, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. As we speak, Trump's impeachment trial is underway, with Democratic impeachment managers from the House making the case for why the Senate should vote to formally convict Trump, which would then likely result in him being unable to run for office in 2024, as some expect him to consider. But in order for Trump to be convicted, a two-thirds supermajority of senators would need to vote to convict, which would necessarily have to include 17 Republican senators. Earlier this week, the vast majority of Republican senators voted against the very constitutionality of convicting a president after he's left office, while Democrats, and indeed many conservative legal scholars, have argued that there is in fact significant precedent for impeaching an official after they've left office. The Senate Republicans' position leaves little doubt that in a few days, regardless of the arguments to come, Donald Trump will almost certainly be acquitted. And indeed, he will be eligible to run again. To talk about all of this and more, I am joined today by two special guests and Braver Angels leaders, Larry Mead and Bill Galston. Larry is a political scientist, an author, and a professor of politics and public policy at New York University. He's repeatedly participated in Braver Angels debates, often to articulate a thoughtful conservative viewpoint and defend President Trump from various criticisms. Bill Galston is also a political scientist. He's a former professor at the University of Maryland and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, who's been publicly critical of Trump in several instances throughout his term in office. I'm thrilled to be joined by two such distinguished thinkers to discuss such an urgent topic, and I'm looking forward to digging in to see where you both might come down on this, and what our listeners might take away from this impeachment episode as we look to bridge the partisan divide in 2021. So, Larry, I'm going to start with you. Yeah. I'm sure that you regret Trump's role in inspiring the attack on the Capitol, but I suspect you would oppose convicting Trump on the grounds that it's improper to impeach and convict a president once he has left office. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you think it's improper? Do you think it's unconstitutional?
I'm not sure about what lawyers might say, but I know that the impeachment provision is really an attempt to deal with a problem that's implicit in the separation of powers. In the American system, unlike the British system, which the founders were thinking about, the legislature doesn't have direct control over the executive because they're separately elected and they have independent powers to a great extent. An outrageous act by the executives cannot immediately be answered by the legislature, by Congress. So the impeachment provision is an attempt to provide a way for Congress to remove the president or any other executive officer who does something that is truly outrageous in the view of Congress. They have to have that, otherwise there would be really no way to hold the president accountable. Now, but in my reading of that, the need to do this depends on the president being in office, and therefore his continuing in office would be a threat in the view of Congress. If the president has already left office, which is what we are now looking at, then it seems to me the case for impeachment is really removed. That isn't what impeachment is designed to do. And this doesn't mean the president shouldn't be accountable at all after he leaves office, but the Constitution refers to proper process of law by which the president could be held accountable for violating ordinary criminal laws. That's something else. That might happen once he's a private person away from office. I'm not speaking to that here, but it seems to me that impeachment doesn't really apply to the case where the president has already left office, because the need to remove him has already been satisfied.
Bill, how do you come down on all of this? I suspect that if you were a senator, you would probably vote to convict, but I imagine there may be some ambivalence about whether this is a good thing for the country to be fighting this fight at this current moment.
Well, let's stay on the narrow question that you posed to Professor Mead, because I think we're in agreement that it is one of the threshold questions surrounding this entire proceeding. And let me begin by saying that although I've studied the Constitution, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not a lawyer of any kind. I've never been a judge. And so all of my opinions are somewhere between amateur and expert on this question. And I suspect that Professor Mead might apply the same description to himself, but that's his business, not mine. I will say this. I have studied very carefully the opinions of some of the leading conservative constitutionalists in the country. People like former law professor and former judge Mike McConnell. People like the young professor of constitutional law at Princeton University, Keith Whittington. People like the very well-known conservative constitutional lawyer and advocate Charles Cooper. And they all reached the conclusion that proceeding against a president after he had left office was appropriate and constitutional. Am I sure they're right? No, I'm not. Let me tell you what I am sure of. If former President Trump were to be convicted through this process, the very next day, or perhaps the same day, a process would be set in motion designed to lead quickly to an adjudication of the question by the Supreme Court. And so I think what we have to say in all honesty is that although some arguments will strike some of us as more decisive than they will, for someone else, that ultimately this is what the lawyers call a matter of first impression. That is, it's a question that's never been adjudicated at the highest constitutional level. Now, there are some people who argue that the Senate and only the Senate is the judge of the constitutionality of impeachment trials. Frankly, given the nature of the separation of powers that Professor Mead referred to quite appropriately and accurately, I find it hard to believe that the Senate could conduct an unreviewable act in this and only this matter. Structurally, that would strike me as an odd position, although there's some respectable people who hold it. So that's what I would say about the narrow question before us. I have to say, I am struck by the fact that in these highly polarized circumstances, especially in impeachment trials, which in recent memory have almost always been straight partisan matters, that 6 Republican senators, including one who changed his mind after hearing the argument, have voted with the Democrats in favor of the constitutionality of the proceeding. Does that prove they're right? Of course not, but it is interesting.
Larry, what do you say to that? I mean, I know I hear Democrats who point to these conservative legal scholars who've identified precedent, and they argue that Republicans are basically retreating to the process argument to avoid having to defend Trump on the merits.
I agree with Bill that the question will certainly be litigated in the Supreme Court if the trial goes ahead. And that means that their judgment is the final one. The other impression I had from reading the text, I found it actually quite difficult to locate the text in the Constitution about impeachment. It's actually spread over several different places. And that indicates to me that the drafters of the Constitution, for them, this is almost an afterthought, and they didn't fully think it through. And they didn't settle the questions we're talking about now. And therefore, it will finally be settled by the court. And that may be the eventual solution. But to say that is really to say that the matter isn't clear in the text, and we should maybe look ahead to a Supreme Court adjudication. Maybe that's what's called for. But I also think, well, let me also mention one other issue that we maybe don't need to focus on very much, and that is the other question I have about impeaching Trump here is that it's not entirely clear to me that what he did in the rally that preceded the attack on the Capitol is sufficiently specific to say that he told people to go to attack the Capitol. I'm not sure that's clear. As a legal matter, looking at it as a prosecutor, would I bring a case to prosecute the president? Would it be clear enough that he actually willed the crowd to go to the Capitol? Or maybe he just rallied them in some general sense, and they inferred it was then time to go to the Capitol. So there's an issue of fact about what the president said and whether that should be viewed as culpable. And I don't have a clear view on that. I think that could in fact be settled in part by the trial in the Senate. Both sides will no doubt have a view on that. If you say that if you decide the president wasn't really specific in saying attack the Capitol, that issue would preempt any trial or any conviction in advance of the constitutional issue. So I don't know that we can settle that. The constitutional issue is, I think, very much as Bill says, it will end up in the court, and the court will have to, in a sense, write the clear text that isn't in the Constitution.
Right. I mean, to me, I feel like there's the legal question and indeed the threshold for, prosecuting someone for incitement of violence is quite high. You would need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that their words contributed to imminent violence.
Yes.
But impeachment ultimately is a political question. And so I think they're also considering the context and totality of Trump's actions, both before the election and after the election, and his claims about electoral fraud. And so putting aside the process and the merits, where do you think you'd come down on the actual conduct in question?
I have to totally disapprove of Trump's conduct. I think his behavior surrounding the election, calling it fraudulent without providing any evidence, and many other things that he did during his term in office, that the manner of which was extremely culpable. I can't ever, there's no way I could approve of Trump's behavior. However, there are some things he did as a policy matter, which were in fact necessary. And I think here, a lot of the restrictions on immigration had to occur. There had to be some way to bring that process under some control. Now, a lot of what Trump did is being undone by the Biden administration. I believe that's probably mistaken. Another thing that Trump did was confront the NATO allies with the need to spend more money on their own defense so they would stop free riding on the United States. And he also took steps to challenge China. China has been cheating on trade for a long time. And yet the dominant view of the other party has been that we should tolerate this in order to maintain a relationship with China. Well, at a certain point, we have to stand up and say, we're being screwed here. This is not fair. And therefore, we have to confront China about these things. So in these respects, I think what Trump did was necessary. And he was doing things that other people have been too decent, perhaps, to do. the Democratic Party is dominated by elites that are entirely too concerned about good behavior and not enough concerned with defending the American interest. I don't mean that I approve everything that Trump did. I think with Trump's withdrawal from the global warming agreement and also the his withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, these I very much question. I don't think those were good things. But in these other respects, he did things that the other party has been too decent and too deferential to do, and we needed to have them done. So Trump's record in office is, I think, mixed.
Well, I didn't realize that we were going to be litigating, the merits of the Trump administration as opposed to the merits of the impeachment and trial. And I suspect that we could consume a lot more than the remaining 38 minutes on that one. And I will say this, that, and I can speak with some authority about the Democratic Party, and that is that even before President Trump took office, the bipartisan consensus on China that had prevailed for a quarter of a century was breaking up. It was breaking up among Republicans and among Democrats. And what we have now is a new bipartisan consensus that we need to get much tougher on China. And so now there's convergent views about the end. And now we're talking about the means of getting tough and getting tough effectively. And I'm actually quite encouraged that despite the extraordinary polarization of the American political system, we are working our way toward a new bipartisan consensus on the most important foreign policy and defense question that we will face for the next few decades. And I think that's to be celebrated.
Yeah, I agree. And Larry, I certainly take your points about policy. And I think, some folks on the left tend to paint with a pretty broad brush when it comes to their criticism. I think, however, some would sort of separate the issue of policy with a higher issue of fidelity to democracy. Yeah. And I think there's a especially grave concern that Trump's conduct in the lead up to the election and after the election showed a blatant disregard for the democratic norms that undergird a peaceful transfer of power. And that's why it's important to draw a line in the sand, to convict him, to set a precedent, and functionally, indeed, to prevent him from running again.
Well, I certainly agree with you that his conduct about the election, his claims of fraud and so on and so on, are completely indefensible, no question about it. But those are not actually what he's being tried for in the Senate. The Senate trial is about inciting the violence against the Capitol. That's a much narrower question. Now, it may be informed by the abuses that Trump committed prior to the election and running up to the election. I think that's clear. Many people think that his behavior was outrageous. I personally agree with that. At the same time, Trump's style was not entirely unconstructed from a Democratic point of view. You have to remember that Trump represents an important slice of the electorate, which had never previously got serious attention in our politics. And this is the electorate of, let's call it the distressed workers of the Midwest, people who really had not been taken seriously by either party for some decades. And Trump found a way to connect to them and make them part of the political process. And that's why he was elected in 2016. Now, what he did with that political capital is obviously questionable. But the fact that these people were given a voice and heard in some serious way for the first time, that was a service to democracy. And therefore, again, that's a plus. I think we have to say Trump, in fact, served a political role in bringing them in to a serious attention. I don't mean that all of that was constructive. On the contrary, involved wrenching changes, particularly for the Republican Party. But something had to be done to listen to these people, and they're getting listened to, and that is, I think, necessary.
I actually agree with Professor Mead on that point, and I actually wrote a whole book about that. And but I do want to build on the distinction he drew between giving them a voice and the use of the political
Yes.
capital.
Yes.
And the point of political leadership is to take strong passions and sentiments and neglected interests and channel them in constructive directions. And and I honestly wish that the president had done that, or former President Trump had done that. And I believe I have to write a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal, and I really do believe in trying to tell the truth and not just a piece of the truth. And if I thought that he had behaved responsibly as a tribune of that neglected group, which has been neglected for decades, I'd be saying something very different. I have often reflected on a sentence by Franklin Roosevelt to the effect, as a matter of fact, this is pretty close to a direct quote, the presidency is preeminently a place of moral leadership. And I take that phrase, moral leadership, very seriously in its multiple dimensions. And I'm afraid that as an advocate for the people he represented, he did not meet that standard. And I don't think he has left our constitutional system better than he found it.
Yeah, yeah. I actually agree with much of that. And the other thing you can say against him, which I also say, not only did he listen to a group that had been neglected, but one can't say that he seriously came up with an answer to their problems. The difficulty of the distressed workers of the Midwest is primarily that the economy has left them behind. The factories that used to support them have moved to Asia. The country's become overwhelmingly dominated by a service economy in which higher skills are valued. And these workers and their entire communities have been abandoned, really. And it's not that we can't do something, but we can't engage just in rhetoric. And I think it's true to say that much of what Trump has done has really not been an answer to their problems. Not that there is an easy answer, but I don't see much serious wrestling with the policy problem. In that respect, he's a disappointment. He got their issue on the table, but he hasn't done a whole lot with it. I think that's true.
Right. Well, one thing that strikes me as we reflect on Trump's time in office is that there's not even a pretense that he was representing all Americans. I mean, he sort of constantly talked about my people and pitted Americans against one another. And I think you could make the argument that sort of flies in the face of what FDR was calling for. And that's not to say that FDR wasn't a partisan in his own right. Another thing that strikes me is some of the underlying structures of our democracy that have fueled this dynamic. I mean, if you think about the party that was in power for the last 4 years, at least electorally, they are fundamentally a minoritarian party. We all know, according to the data, that, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2 or 3 points. The very structure of the Senate means that in terms of, raw representation, I think the Democrats currently represent 30 million more Americans than do the Republicans. I wonder how can we continue our course with those dynamics, given that they've just mapped so much more as an advantage for Republicans? And how should that inform the steps we take in policy when it comes to democracy expansion? I'll start with you, Bill, on that point.
Well, I think it's very important that as we try to move forward from where we are, that basic norms of civic equality are affirmed and used as foundations for the reform of our political system. And I'll just put a proposition on the table that I think Professor Mead will agree with, and that is that one of the measures of the health of our political system is the extent to which all people who are legally eligible, but only those who are legally eligible, can participate in our electoral system.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think that anyone is in favor of fraud, although some people practice it in the dark of night. And at least in principle, I don't think that anybody is against the idea of maximum political participation by people who are legally eligible to do so.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to say something that he may disagree with, and that is, I think some Republican politicians believe, and in fact, the former President Trump said it out loud, that beyond a certain point, high political participation is not in the interests of the Republican Party, right? And the president, the president actually said very honestly, but quite injudiciously, well, if we expand the electorate, the Republicans will, quote, never win another election. That may be true. So I think that the Republican Party should focus more on how it needs to broaden its base to become a genuine majority party, or at least have that potential on a regular basis, and less on various devices that may have the effect of reducing participation. And I will say, if you look at presidential elections over the past 2 decades, Republican presidential candidates have gone above 50% only once. That was George W. Bush in 2004. That is not exactly the sign of a healthy majority party. And and if I were a Republican looking forward, I would be thinking 24/7 about ways of building on the existing base rather than simply relying on that base.
I agree with what you're saying, Bill, in that efforts by Republicans to restrict the suffrage, to limit the ability to vote on the part of people who are legal, this is out of bounds. It should never have happened. One of the most reassuring things about the aftermath of the election was that Republican secretaries of state in various states, although subject to pressure from Trump, refused to abandon their constitutional responsibilities.
Totally agree with that.
There wasn't a single case of someone who was subject to, they may have faced pressure, they resisted it, and they did the right thing. And I'm proud of that. I think that there should never be any question that people who are legally eligible should be allowed to vote. On the other hand, the broader argument about the Republicans being a minority party is only true if you mean how many votes they command right now, which is certainly true. At this point, Democrats have a wider popular vote. However, the Democratic coalition is made up much more clearly of discrete social groups that have an agenda of getting something from government. And they can't really claim to represent the whole country any more than the Republicans can. The Republicans have fewer than half the votes, but Democrats have really very little appeal to the broad public except these groups that vote for them to get something. And the Democratic Party is very much an alliance between an extremely credentialed, very impressive elite, the kind of people who staff the Biden administration, and lower income groups, Blacks, Hispanics, immigrants in particular, who are looking for something from the party that's very concrete. They want greater social benefits. They want various ways to improve their opportunities in America. There's nothing wrong with that in principle, but that has elicits quite a bit of suspicion on the part of the Republican voters, because they're not looking for government to restructure things for them, maybe, or not in the same way. They're not looking for benefits, concrete benefits from government. They're looking for an overall economy that gives them a better chance than they've had in recent decades. That's true. but they don't think of themselves as trying to get something specific from government. So the nature of the Democratic coalition stream is also a reason for concern, even though right now it has more votes than the Republicans.
Yeah, I think part of the issue for the Republican Party is that, even though President Trump did slightly better with blacks and significantly better with Hispanics than he did last time around, the party overall is becoming whiter, more male, and less educated, and is in fact numerically shrinking. Trump was actually bringing new folks into the fold. However, he was doing it with angry populism. And and so the base of the Republican Party now is sort of mired in this conspiratorial anger. And the nature of gerrymandering and the primary system means that for Republicans who want to stand up against this mindset, they fear that they will be primaried by someone who will get Trump's blessing. And so I wonder, how can that be overcome? And then how might the two parties be able to come together when one party's base is arguably submerged in a different reality than the one to which the mainstream subscribes?
I think what you say is accurate, but it's not the whole truth. Part of the bitterness of the populist movement is against what are perceived to be the privileges given to the groups that associate with the Democratic Party. Their belief, not without a basis, is that Blacks, Hispanics, immigrants, groups that are not in every way representative of the country, have got undue attention from Washington, have done for decades. I mean, there's an entire structure of preferences in favor of minorities and women also, going back to the Civil Rights Act of the 60s, which comprehensively put white men at a disadvantage in terms of employment and other opportunities in this country. Chris Caldwell has argued this in a book called The Age of Entitlement. We really have a parallel constitution for the public sector, the nonprofit sector, and the universities. And in these worlds, and I've experienced this myself, white men are at a permanent disadvantage because of governmental preferences for the groups associated with the Democratic Party. And that's wrong. There's something wrong about that. And I don't claim the Trumpian voters are mostly involved in that. Mostly they're worse off. They have worse jobs, and they're not even working at all, or they've been abandoned by the economy. But they're bitter at the privileges that the other side has. And that is much of the reason for their unruliness. I don't think this justifies violence. I think that I would like to see a better counterargument coming from them than simply violence and opposition. But they're angry for a reason. It isn't only that the economy has abandoned them, but the system has favored the groups associated with the left, even when the left hasn't been very leftist. And I mean, it's only recently, in the last couple of years, that the Democratic Party's moved consistently to the left. I don't think this is really what we're talking about now. What I'm talking about now is preferences that really go back 50 years and which have been very much to the advantage of the groups that associate with the Democratic Party. And that has to be questioned.
Bill, what do you think about that argument that for decades, it's white men who have been at permanent disadvantage in America?
Well, if I wanted to be rhetorical, I would say that must be the way it appears to people who have been at an advantage for centuries in America. But that's just a rhetorical retort. And I will say, though, that if you've enjoyed a certain position in society, let us call it a position of privilege, which is replaced by a process that diminishes that privilege. From the standpoint of people who enjoy privileges, that will be experienced as an injustice. That doesn't mean it is unjust, but as a psychological matter, it will be experienced as unjust. But let me, but I actually think here that the central question for the kinds of people that Professor Mead and I are talking about is not so much affirmative acts by government against them as it is by decades of government neglect of their interests. And in retrospect, I mean, let me give you an example. Between, when Bill Clinton left office, there were about 19 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. In the next 6 years, before the Great Recession even started, 3 million of those manufacturing jobs disappeared. More than 15% of our manufacturing jobs that it had taken decades to create disappeared in 6 years, and nobody in either political party even noticed.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't have anything to do. That doesn't have anything to do with affirmative action replacing white
That's
factory,
true.
black factory workers, or Latino factory workers. A combination of neglect and bad policy choices sponsored by both political parties had created that catastrophe. And I have a long list of acts of commission and omission that created that. The Great Recession then stripped away an additional 2.5 million of those manufacturing jobs. We've never gotten them back, even when times were much better towards the end of the decade just ended. So I think Professor Mead and I are in agreement here, focusing on the deep processes, of economic transformation aided and abetted by poor government policy. That would lead the conversation in the direction that it needs to go. Namely, why do we find ourselves where we are, and what the bleep can we do about it? And I think we might also agree that campaigning in, rundown factory towns and promising them that the steel mills and the aluminum plants will open up when I take office creates false hopes that are bound to lead to disappointment and even deeper bitterness.
Yes.
Right? Because, I think all of American history shows that going back to the way things were is rarely an option. It's really an option.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And you have to look forward and see what you can do to improve people's circumstances, in real political space and time, given the fact that Heraclitus was right, and you can't step into the same river twice.
Yeah.
Right. And which is why the word again in MAGA,
All right.
I have always viewed as dangerous because it's so misleading.
Yeah, Bill, I actually agree with almost everything you've said here, that the fundamental offense against the Trumpian base is the neglect of the economic problem. I do agree with that. And Trump, as I mentioned, has really not come up with an answer. Indeed, no one else has come up with an answer. We can't go back to the old economy. All of that is true. But the deference to the specific groups is still very important. Let me give an example. The recent Black Lives Matter movement, or the anti-racism movement, which blossomed after the killing of George Floyd, what is, to me, questionable about that movement was the massive deference shown by the entire white leadership of all institutions in this country, including government, including the universities, and all the foundations, and all the professional groups. They all kowtowed to the movement and said, oh yes, America is a deeply racist country, and we must take all this action. I mean, my children are at a school, both of them are at schools, in which there are massive attempts made to turn the institution into a paragon of racial equity, which puts enormous pressure on the non-Black students, on whom all the obligations rest. And that's also true of the universities. And when the Trumpian base sees this, they see a group that has enormous presumptive rightness in everything that it demands. And what it demands is holistic and totalistic, involves a transformation of the society. And there is no criticism of this coming from whites at all. everything is deference to these activists. I don't mean they're wrong. They're people of great ability whom I admire personally. But the deference to them, the refusal to have an open debate, the privilege that they have never to be contradicted publicly about anything they say is an outrage to the Trumpian base. They're right about that. It doesn't mean that we're about to do what the activists want. Far from it. They don't have a specific agenda. That's one of their problems. But the deference to them is exactly what the Trumpian base doesn't get. Nobody defers to jobless workers of the Midwest. We debate how to help them. We say that we don't have answers. That's true. That's honest. But we don't talk about the Democratic groups with a similar honesty. And the same goes for immigrants and Hispanics. These groups too, people defer to, and there's no explicit criticism, no notion that their demands can in principle be resisted or questioned in any way. What we do is tacitly refuse to do what they want. They don't get what they want. I don't say they get what they want, but they get enormous deference. And the Trumpian base is angry about that, and they should be angry.
Well, let me, let me offer, not a completely different view, but a somewhat different view. And let me talk about my own political party for just a minute. Okay, after the killing of George Floyd, and after the demonstrations had worked their way through the political system, a clear distinction could be observed, I think, between reformist groups and more radical groups. The reformist groups said, and based on my understanding of the situation with considerable justice, that there were problems, endemic and systemic problems with policing, and that there needed to be reforms, both at the level of police doctrine and training, and also the relationship between police hierarchies and rank and file, et cetera, and a lot of other issues. And I noted with interest last year, and then President Trump seemed very happy about this, that there just seemed to be a consensus forming about the need for policing reforms, and as a matter of fact, and other criminal justice reforms, and a serious first step was taken in that direction in 2020. And there actually were productive conversations about police reform going on across party lines in both the House and the Senate. And I've been involved with bipartisan groups that were part of those discussions. So there's the reformist strand on the one hand, and then the more radical strand on the other that talked about defunding the police, et cetera. Then you ask, who turned out to be the predominant tendency and who turned out to be the more marginal tendency? And the answer there was that the man who won the Democratic nomination was critical of the more radical movement, the defund the police movement, from the start. He said so from the start.
Yeah.
He made clear that no part of their agenda would make it into the Democratic Party platform, which it didn't. And many Democrats since the election, which did not go well for Democrats in Congress, have spoken up very vocally against the more radical elements of the movement. So from the standpoint of the kind of the electoral politics that I pay attention to, nothing like deference was given to people advancing the more radical agenda. Now, let's shift to the venue of education. There, it's a different story. And one of the problems that I have is that a lot of people who talk about these questions are located in universities. on both sides of the argument. And I think that, I think that progressives wield their moral power in universities to excess. And I think conservatives tend to believe that the rest of the country is just like universities. And I think those are two big mistakes.
No, I agree with that.
So, I spend a lot of time telling, I have many, many conservative friends who are located in universities. Their life is in the institution, which is, for better or for worse, not representative of the rest of the country, but they assume it is. University politics is not equal to real politics for precisely the reason that Henry Kissinger stated so memorably.
I'm trying to think what Kissinger said.
Academic arguments are so bitter because the stakes are so low.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're absolutely right to say that universities are not representative. I wouldn't say that any intelligent person on the right would allege that, but they would say that in terms of influence over actual policy, universities have quite a bit of power. And the other thing about the current administration, although Biden is certainly a moderate on race demands, I agree with that. He did not line up with the hardline anti-racism movement. But then you look at the character of his administration. Except for the national security people, all of the cabinet secretaries are all representatives of this or that group that is part of the Democratic Party. So we have Blacks, Hispanics, we also have women in large numbers. We have Native Americans. I mean, virtually every head of a department in the Biden administration is carrying political freight for a particular group. Now, that's not entirely new. I realize that administrations have been like that since forever. But now the representatives that are being catered to are all parts of these groups that make special demands on government and whose demands cannot be overtly resisted. See, the thing that makes for moral privilege here is the fact that one's demands are deferred to openly. They may not be granted. You may not get what you want, but people defer. And they accept social responsibility for what you want, even though Congress may refuse to agree. So liberals basically kowtow to the demands made by the outgroups. And then they're surprised when conservatives are not only resistant to those demands, but morally offended by the character of the demands and the deference to the demands. That's the problem with Biden. He personally is a moderate, but the people around him are not moderates. And that was also true under Obama. Obama was personally admirable, moderate in most of his instincts, but the people he appointed to office were people who were quite far to the left and who deferred on all these questions. And it's that establishment which the Republicans are afraid of with reason. It isn't just about votes in Congress or even votes in election. The question is a government which is permanently committed to a series of reformist objectives and that pursue social equality for these groups and for women at the expense of white men. Now, not all white men are vulnerable to that. The Trumpian base is too depressed and defeated economically to be very much subject to that. But a lot of other white men are subject to it. And the leaders of those institutions kowtow entirely to the left. And it isn't just the universities, it's the entire nonprofit sector, the entire governmental sector. They all talk like this. And it's as if this is why the Trumpian people say, we want our country back. And they have a point. The country has been taken away from them by the government itself and isn't really dependent on a particular election. It's a regime that goes back 50 years. And that regime that is now back in power.
Yeah, I wanted to just hone in on this point because I think it speaks to a fundamental disagreement between liberals and conservatives when it comes to representation, particularly in leadership. It reminds me when Sonia Sotomayor was nominated to the Supreme Court and Barack Obama spoke to the value of having, a wise Latina on the court. And I think you heard conservatives articulating a similar argument to Larry that this was basically, granting her special stock because of her race. And then you had, liberals sort of acknowledging the legacy of privilege, systemic racism that resulted in virtually every Supreme Court justice up until the year 2000 being a white man, and also making the argument that in terms of making better policy decisions, those decisions result in better outcomes when the group making them comes from a wider pool of people, both in terms of their background, their race, and their lived experience. And I hear this divide coming sort of again and again. And so I wonder, Bill, how do you think about this? How can we find a higher synthesis here that sort of honors both perspectives?
Well, I think that's the right question. And the issue that we've now broached would take much longer to address than the 3 minutes we have left. But let me simply say, when I hear phrases like, we should take our country back, that's a claim by a piece of the country to ownership of the whole country. That is not the right way to think about this question. We are all here. And by one process or another, we are all Americans now. And, it's not their country. It's not my country. It's not the Democrats' country. It's not the Republicans' country. It's our country. And until we recognize that we must find a way of living together and set aside rhetoric that substitutes the part for the whole, we'll never make progress. It is not their country.
Well, I agree with that. In a literal term, getting country back overstates what I think they expect. And I wouldn't endorse any such idea. I agree with Bill. It's a pluralistic country with many elements. That isn't what I think I'm objected to, and I think the base objects to. It isn't really that. It's the deference paid to some parts of that community, which give them a moral and to some extent an actual inside track that is not available to the bulk of the population that is white or European really in background. That is the problem. And that is a real problem. I mean, I'm not going to go into my personal story, but believe me, I have been beaten up very badly by affirmative action, by women, by Blacks throughout my career. And I'm not alone in that. Many white men in the university world face this. I don't mean the university is the same as the entire country, but the experience of Washington, I worked in Washington, I've spent a lot of time in Washington, and this problem of deference to a certain set of interests, the effect of that is to shift the entire responsibility for social change onto white men. They become the residual group against whom all claims are made. Now, some necessary changes are necessary, certainly. These other groups need more attention and reward than they've traditionally had going back decades. I agree with that. But the nature of it is quite one-sided, and there is no sense of a counter-argument. Not until Trump did the losers really get on the political agenda. And that's the ultimate reason why Trump represents something larger than just Trump. I think there's a populist movement out there that is genuinely aggrieved. And that would be true even if the demands made of the other groups are entirely reasonable in and of themselves. It's the moral asymmetry that is really objectionable here. And that's what we have to question.
Well, one of the things, I started to make a list of all of the groups that now articulate grievances against the status quo. And one of the striking things to me is how long a list it is and how close it comes to spanning the entire political spectrum. And so the United States right now, more than at any time in my life, from the populist right to the progressive left, is now made up of grievance groups. The only group in Americans, well, that seems to me there are two groups in American society, only two groups that are not articulating grievances to any considerable extent. One is the corporate sector, and the other is upper middle class professionals. They and we are the true conservative forces left in American society, and everyone else has a grievance against the system. And I think that helps explain the tenor of contemporary politics. And I spend almost all of my time thinking about what to do about this. And it's clear that there's no solution to be found by addressing one piece of it to the expense of the other. And different groups, the interests and grievances of different groups have to be coordinated into a plan of action to a much greater extent than they have been in my memory.
Well, I think that, yeah, Larry, do you want to close us out? I was going to say that we've done a very good job diagnosing the problem, and we probably have to do another podcast to talk about the potential solutions.
Actually, I agree with Bill that we need to bring the pieces together. And I don't really differ with that. I think that has to happen. And I'm in favor of social change. I'm in favor of multicultural. I'm not trying to go back to an earlier America that was more dominated by the people like the Trumpian base. That's much too strong. It's rather that to put the pieces together requires some give and take on the part of each of the pieces. And I don't see that now. On the Democratic side, the major pieces are honored by presumptions of their rightness that are essentially unlimited. And on the Trumpian side, on the conservative side, there's counter-arguments that are openly asserted, and there should be counter-arguments. But the counter-arguments are all against the right. I don't see explicit, overt disagreement with the claims of the Democratic groups. They don't face open opposition. And because that's thought to be racist and improper. See, what Trump did, and I don't entirely approve of this, what Trump did was he was willing to make criticisms of those groups. That was what made him different. That's why he was popular. And that's precisely what Trump did that was viewed as outrageous. I also viewed it as outrageous. It was excessive. But at least he was willing to say that there are counter-arguments, that's what has never been possible before. Now Trump's gone, and we're not going to see that again. We're going to see ongoing deference to a set of moral absolutes that are all on the left. And unless that changes, unless we're willing to talk candidly about all the groups and their limits and the things to be done and not done for them, you're not going to come together.
Well, I think we should end there. And I think this whole conversation has illuminated the importance of having these conversations, of exploring viewpoints that can be sharply divergent, but yet undergirded by common values that allow for the exploration of common ground on policy and other things in good faith. And that's what we do at Braver Angels. And so I thank you both for coming on. We started with impeachment, but we wound up touching all sorts of deep themes about politics and culture. And so I will certainly be back in touch with both of you for further opportunities to engage in our podcasts and programming. For now, I will just say to our audience that we welcome feedback, compliments, criticisms, questions, suggestions. We take it all. You can write us at media@braverangels.org. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe. Please share this podcast with your friends, and we will see you next time.